In a city divided by race and injustice, one mother's life is shattered in a single violent moment. Renee Harris, a hardworking nurse and devoted mother, is mistaken for a thief and brutally assaulted by Detective Jack Connolly in front of her young daughter. The shocking act is caught on camera, sparking national outrage. But as the case gains momentum, dark secrets come to light. Renee's past as a police informant, long buried, is dragged back into the spotlight. Jack, too, hides his own demons, haunted by the death of his daughter, and his impulsive action may not have been as random as it seemed. As both are drawn deeper into a web of lies and manipulation, Renee and Jack must face an even greater conspiracy that links their lives in ways neither expected. Forced into an uneasy alliance, can they uncover the truth before it destroys everything they hold dear? The late afternoon sun filtered through the windows of Renee Harris's modest apartment, casting a warm glow over the small, cluttered living room. The smell of dinner, chicken in the oven, mingled with the fresh scent of Amaya's newly washed ballet clothes as Renee folded them neatly. "Mom, are you coming to watch me today?" Amaya asked, her wide brown eyes hopeful as she tugged on Renee's sleeve. Renee smiled, brushing a hand through her daughter's soft curls. "Of course, sweetheart, I wouldn't miss it for the world." Amaya grinned, a dimple forming on her cheek as she twirled in excitement. "I'm working on my pirouettes. Miss Daphne says I'm getting better." "You're amazing, baby." Renee bent down, pulling Amaya into a quick hug before glancing at the clock on the wall. "But we need to get going or we'll be late." The rush to get out the door was always the same. Renee's life was a careful balance of work, motherhood, and making sure Amaya had the opportunities she never had. Today was no different, except that Renee felt the weight of exhaustion pressing down harder than usual. "Mom, can we stop for ice cream after ballet?" Amaya asked as she skipped ahead to the front door, her bag bouncing on her back. "Maybe," Renee replied, grabbing her keys. "But first we have to get there on time." They left the apartment together, Amaya still chattering away as Renee locked the door behind them. It was just another typical day. Or so it seemed. The ballet studio was alive with the sound of classical music, the soft shuffle of ballet shoes, and the squeaks of the wooden floor under tiny feet. Renee leaned against the glass window, watching as Amaya moved gracefully across the room, her face focused, her movements precise. The other parents chatted nearby, but Renee's mind wandered. Her phone buzzed in her hand, a reminder of the texts she hadn't responded to, the bills that were due, and the constant juggling act that came with being both mother and provider. "Amaya's really improving," one of the other mothers, Susan, said, standing beside Renee. "She loves it," Renee replied, her smile proud but distracted. Ballet is her world. As the class wrapped up, Renee glanced outside the studio window and noticed a commotion across the street. Police cars lined the block near a boutique store. She didn't pay much attention, assuming it was a minor disturbance. Maybe a shoplifter. This neighborhood had its share of trouble, but it had never really affected her or Amaya. Not personally. She checked her phone again as Amaya came bounding out of the studio, still in her tights and leotard. "Mom? Did you see? I did 3 turns without stopping." "I saw, baby. You were incredible." Renee bent down to help Amaya with her coat, feeling a flicker of tension in her chest as the sound of sirens grew louder. Something was off. "Let's get home," Renee said, her voice a bit too firm. She could sense that tonight was not going to go as smoothly as she had hoped. As they stepped out onto the street, the cold evening air bit at Renee's skin. The streets had quieted, but the police presence lingered near the boutique across the way. She held Amaya's hand tightly as they walked to the car parked nearby. Without warning, a police cruiser pulled up to the curb beside them, the doors flinging open. Renee's heart raced as 2 officers stepped out, their faces set in stern determination. She recognized one of them from the neighborhood. Detective Jack Connolly, a tall, broad-shouldered man whose reputation preceded him. "Hey, hold on a second." Connolly's voice boomed as he pointed in Renee's direction. Renee stopped, confusion clouding her face. "Is there a problem, officer?" "Where were you about 20 minutes ago?" Connolly asked, his eyes narrowing as he approached. "I was picking up my daughter from ballet class," Renee answered, trying to keep her voice steady as Amaya clutched her hand tighter. "Look, we got a report of a robbery in the area, And you match the description, Connolly said, his voice hard. That's ridiculous. I didn't. Before Renee could finish, Connolly grabbed her arm, yanking her toward him. Don't resist. Mom? Amaya cried, her voice high-pitched with fear as Renee struggled to pull free. Get your hands off me. I didn't do anything. Renee's voice trembled with anger and fear as she wrenched her arm back. Connolly didn't hesitate. His fist connected with Renee's face before she had time to react. The force of the punch sent her sprawling to the ground, her vision blurring as pain exploded across her cheek. She heard Amaya's scream, sharp and piercing, cutting through the chaos. The world around them seemed to freeze for a moment, until the sound of a phone recording broke through. A bystander capturing the brutal scene on video. Renee's cheek throbbed as she sat on the couch in their small apartment, an ice pack pressed to her face. The world felt surreal, like she was watching someone else's life unravel. Amaya sat beside her, silent for the first time all day, her wide eyes still red from crying. Renee's hand shook as she stroked her daughter's hair, trying to offer comfort that she couldn't feel herself. Mom, why did he hit you? Amaya asked, her voice barely a whisper. Renee closed her eyes, the weight of everything crashing down on her. I don't know, baby. I really don't know. Her phone buzzed incessantly on the coffee table. Every few seconds, a new notification popped up, each one more overwhelming than the last. The video of the assault was already going viral. News stations, social media, even local activists were sharing it. People were already calling her a symbol of injustice, another name added to a growing list of victims. But all Renee could think about was Amaya's terrified face, the look in her daughter's eyes as she watched everything fall apart. I'm sorry, sweetheart, Renee whispered, pulling Amaya into her arms. I'm so sorry. The next morning, the world had changed. Renee sat at the kitchen table, her phone buzzing non-stop with calls and messages. She didn't want to answer any of them. The video had exploded across the internet overnight, sparking protests and outrage from every corner of the country. Renee Harris, a single mother and victim of police brutality, was now a household name. Amaya sat quietly in the living room, her ballet shoes discarded on the floor, a sharp reminder of the innocence shattered the night before. Renee's doorbell rang, and when she peeked through the window, she saw a group of reporters gathered outside, cameras pointed at her building. Her stomach twisted. This wasn't what she wanted. She didn't ask for any of this attention. She glanced at the TV, where news anchors were already discussing her case, calling for justice, for reform. Everyone wanted something from her. Answers, statements, interviews. But all Renee wanted was her life back. As she turned away from the window, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from an old name, one she hadn't seen in years. Marcus Shaw. We need to talk, the message read. Renee's heart sank. Her past, the one she had worked so hard to bury, was about to come back to haunt her. Renee stood frozen at the window, the persistent buzz of her phone filling the apartment like an unrelenting swarm of bees. Outside, reporters gathered, their cameras trained on her front door. A cacophony of voices echoed through the streets, all of them eager to capture the face of the latest victim in an all-too-familiar story. Her phone buzzed again. A notification from a news outlet flashed on the screen. Another incident of police brutality shakes the nation. Renee sank onto the couch, pressing her hands to her temples. I didn't ask for any of this, she muttered under her breath. Amaya sat beside her, hugging her knees to her chest, her eyes wide with confusion. Mom, why are all those people outside? Why do they keep talking about you? Renee sighed, forcing herself to put on a brave face. They're just curious, baby. They want to know what happened. But why did he hit you? Amaya's voice trembled, her small hands gripping her mother's arm. Renee hesitated, searching for words that wouldn't frighten her daughter. Sometimes, people make mistakes, even grown-ups. The doorbell rang, causing both of them to jump. Renee's heart raced as she peered through the peephole. It wasn't a reporter this time. It was a lawyer. Renee had expected this, but it didn't make the moment any easier. Renee sat stiffly in her kitchen, facing Elliot Green, a civil rights attorney. He was a calm, middle-aged man with a gentle demeanor, but his eyes were sharp and focused, scanning every detail of the situation. You have a strong case, Renee, Elliot began, his voice steady. The video is indisputable. The officer assaulted you without cause, in front of witnesses. I don't know if I want to go through with it, Renee admitted, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. The attention, the way people are already talking about me, I never wanted to be part of some movement. Elliot leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. This isn't just about you anymore. This is bigger. It's about justice, for you, and for everyone who's been through something like this. You can make a difference. Renee bit her lip, glancing at Amaya, who was quietly playing in the living room. But what about my daughter? She's been through so much already. Elliot softened. I understand, but you're also teaching her something important. Standing up for what's right. If we do this, we'll protect your privacy as much as we can. I'll make sure of it. Renee looked away, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. I need time to think. Of course, Elliot nodded, standing up. But don't take too long. The sooner we act, the better. The world is watching. As he left, Renee felt torn between the desire to protect her daughter and the growing pressure to fight back. And as much as she wanted to leave the past behind, it was clear that the world wasn't going to let her move on quietly. Detective Jack Connolly sat in the cold, sterile room of the Internal Affairs Office, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Across from him sat Captain Lawrence, his superior, whose gaze was unforgiving. Do you even understand the magnitude of what you've done, Jack? Captain Lawrence's voice was low but harsh. You punched a civilian, an innocent woman, in front of her child. And now, the whole country is calling for your head. Jack stared at the floor, his jaw clenched. I thought she was the suspect. I didn't mean. You didn't mean to? Captain Lawrence cut him off. Your personal issues don't give you the right to lash out like that. You've jeopardized this entire department, and I'm going to be honest with you. Your career is hanging by a thread. Jack's heart pounded in his chest. I made a mistake, he muttered, his voice hollow. But I didn't. I don't care about your excuses, Jack, Lawrence snapped, leaning forward. What I care about is that this department is now under scrutiny because of your actions. You're suspended, effective immediately. Jack felt the weight of the world crashing down on him as he left the office. His mind raced, replaying the moment over and over, the punch, Renee's terrified face, and the chaos that followed. He couldn't shake the guilt, but something deeper gnawed at him. Something about that night still didn't sit right. As he stepped outside, his phone buzzed with a message. Marcus Shaw. Jack frowned at the name. He hadn't heard from Marcus in years, not since the old days when everything had been simpler. Or so he thought. We need to talk, the message read. Jack stared at the screen for a long moment before tucking the phone away. Whatever this was, it was about to get a whole lot worse. Renee sat on the edge of her bed, her thoughts swirling in a million directions. She had tried to push it out of her mind, but the message from Marcus Shaw loomed like a dark cloud over her. When her phone buzzed again, she finally picked it up. It was Marcus, the man she hadn't spoken to in years. The man who knew her past. Meet me at the diner. 6 p.m. She didn't want to go. She didn't want to face any of it. But she also knew she couldn't avoid it forever. At the small, dimly lit diner on the edge of town, Marcus was waiting for her, just as he always had been. His face was the same, weathered, calculating, with eyes that missed nothing. He smiled when he saw her, but it didn't reach his eyes. Renee, he greeted her, motioning for her to sit. It's been a long time. Not long enough, she replied, her voice tight as she took a seat across from him. Marcus chuckled, his fingers drumming on the table. Still the same fire, I see. What do you want, Marcus? Renee asked, crossing her arms. Why now? Why after all these years? Marcus leaned back, his expression shifting. I saw what happened. You're in a bad spot, Renee, and I'm offering help. I don't need your help, she snapped. You might not have a choice, Marcus said, his tone darkening. The past doesn't stay buried forever, especially not when it's as messy as ours. Renee's stomach twisted. She had spent years trying to outrun that life, to protect Amaya from the things she had done. But Marcus was right. Her past was creeping back, and she didn't know how to stop it. Later that night, Renee sat in the silence of her apartment, her mind racing. She had thought she could keep the past buried, but Marcus's words rang in her ears. You might not have a choice. Her phone buzzed again, pulling her out of her thoughts. She hesitated before picking it up. This time, the message wasn't from Marcus. It was from an unknown number, and the words sent a chill down her spine. "We know what you did. Stay quiet, or you'll regret it." Renee's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the screen. Someone else knew. Someone was watching her, threatening her. Her hand shook as she set the phone down, her heart pounding in her chest. She thought back to Marcus's warning. He had said she couldn't outrun her past, and now it seemed like the shadows were closing in faster than she could escape. She glanced toward Amaya's room, where her daughter slept peacefully, unaware of the storm brewing around them. Renee swallowed hard, realizing that this fight was no longer just about her. It was about Amaya, her safety, and the future she had fought so hard to protect. She couldn't run anymore. She had to face the truth. Renee sat stiffly in the courtroom, her fingers gripping the edge of her seat. The space was cold and sterile, the harsh lighting casting shadows across the room. Across from her, Detective Jack Connolly sat at the defendant's table, his face drawn, his posture tense. The weight of the first hearing hung in the air, thick with anticipation and dread. The judge, an older man with a stern expression, shuffled through papers before addressing the court. "This is the initial hearing regarding the civil lawsuit filed by Miss Renee Harris against the city's police department and Detective Jack Connolly. Both sides will present preliminary statements." Renee's lawyer, Elliot Green, rose confidently. "Your Honor, we intend to prove that Detective Connolly used excessive force without just cause, resulting in both physical and emotional trauma to my client and her young daughter." Jack's lawyer, a seasoned defense attorney named Martin Gable, immediately countered. "Your Honor, Detective Connolly acted within reason, responding to a possible suspect. While the situation escalated, we believe it was an unfortunate misunderstanding rather than malicious intent." Renee could feel her pulse quicken as the lawyers went back and forth. But her gaze kept drifting to Jack, who sat silently, his jaw clenched. He looked almost as trapped as she felt. Their eyes met for a moment, but Jack quickly averted his gaze, guilt and anger simmering just beneath the surface. The judge called for a recess, and as people shuffled out, Renee leaned into Elliot. "They're already twisting this," she whispered. "They're making it sound like it was just a mistake." "That's what they do," Elliot said, his voice low but firm. "But don't worry, we have the video, the witnesses, and your testimony. This is only the beginning." Jack stepped outside the courthouse, his hands stuffed in his pockets as he tried to block out the noise of the media frenzy surrounding the case. His mind was a mess, memories clashing with reality, each one dragging him deeper into the guilt he couldn't escape. He had never meant for any of this to happen. That night kept replaying in his head, the adrenaline, the suspicion, and then the moment his fist connected with Renee's face. But there was something else too, something that had been haunting him ever since the incident. The look on Amaya's face, the terror in her eyes. Jack leaned against a wall, closing his eyes, but the flashbacks hit hard. The screech of tires, the broken glass, the stillness of his daughter's body after the car crash, everything came back in brutal clarity. He had lost control that night too, and now the weight of another mistake crushed him. "You're spiraling, Jack." The voice startled him out of his thoughts. It was Officer Jenna Park, his partner, her face unreadable as she approached him. "I don't know what to do, Jenna," Jack admitted, his voice hoarse. "I messed up and now they want my head on a platter." Jenna sighed, crossing her arms. "You need to figure out why you're really here. This isn't just about the case, is it?" Jack's eyes darkened as he shook his head. "No, it's not." Back in her apartment, Renee sat on the couch, her phone buzzing with notifications. The media had latched onto the case, spinning it in every direction. Some outlets painted her as a brave mother standing up against police brutality, while others questioned her background, digging into every detail of her past. Renee Harris, innocent victim or former criminal? She stared at the headline, her stomach churning. It was starting, the scrutiny, the prying, the attempts to discredit her. All of the things she feared were now in motion. Amaya sat beside her, watching TV, blissfully unaware of the world outside. Renee turned off her phone, forcing herself to smile at her daughter. "How about we make some dinner, sweetheart?" Renee asked, trying to distract herself from the media storm brewing around them. "Can we have spaghetti?" Amaya's face lit up. Of course. Renee stood up, heading to the kitchen, but the unease gnawed at her. The case had become a spectacle, and soon every part of her life, especially her past, would be dragged into the light. That evening, a knock on the door shattered the brief peace. Renee's heart skipped a beat as she opened the door to find Marcus Shaw standing there, his expression grim. "Can I come in?" he asked, his voice low. Renee hesitated but nodded, stepping aside to let him in. She knew this wasn't a social visit. Marcus glanced around the apartment before focusing on her. "You need to be careful, Renee." "Careful? What do you mean?" Renee folded her arms, bracing herself for whatever he was about to say. "You've stirred up a lot of attention with this case." Marcus continued, his tone clipped. "People are digging into your past, into things you thought were buried. There are some who don't want the truth to come out, people who would rather see you fall than win." Renee's heart raced. "Are you threatening me?" "No," Marcus replied quickly. "I'm trying to warn you. There are bigger players involved in this than you realize. This isn't just about one bad cop. It goes deeper than that." Renee clenched her fists, frustration and fear bubbling inside her. "Then why don't you tell me what's really going on? You've always kept things from me, Marcus." "It's not that simple." He shook his head, his gaze hardening. "Just trust me on this. You're not safe. They'll come after you if you push too hard." Renee took a deep breath, her mind reeling. She had known getting involved in this case would be dangerous, but Marcus's words chilled her to the bone. She had fought so hard to leave that life behind, but it seemed like no matter what she did, the past would always find a way to drag her back. Later that night, Renee sat alone at her kitchen table, her thoughts racing. Marcus's warning echoed in her mind, each word laced with danger and mystery. She couldn't shake the feeling that he was holding back something important, something that could change everything. Her phone buzzed with another message. This time, it was from an unknown number, and the text sent a shiver down her spine. "Drop the case, or you'll regret it." Renee stared at the screen, her pulse quickening. The threats were becoming more real, more dangerous. She knew now that there was more at play than just the lawsuit. Someone, or some group, was working in the shadows, pulling strings, trying to manipulate the outcome of the case. She thought about Amaya, sleeping peacefully in her room, unaware of the storm brewing around them. Renee's determination hardened. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for her daughter's future, for their safety, and for the truth. Renee stood up, walking to the window and looking out into the dark streets below. Whatever was coming, she wasn't going to back down. Not now. The conspiracy was just beginning to reveal itself, and Renee knew that if she didn't uncover the truth, it could destroy everything she had worked so hard to protect. Renee stared at the flickering news broadcast, her phone ringing off the hook with calls from reporters, activists, and people she didn't even know. The weight of the case was pressing down on her, suffocating her every breath. The constant barrage of threats and media attention was exhausting, and no matter how hard she tried to shield Amaya, her daughter was feeling the pressure too. Amaya walked into the room, her small frame weighed down by the tension that filled the air. "Mom, why can't we just go back to the way things were?" she asked, her voice soft and sad. Renee knelt down, wrapping her arms around her daughter. "I wish we could, baby. I really do. But this fight, it's bigger than us." Amaya pulled back slightly, her eyes wide with worry. "But what if they hurt you?" Renee's heart clenched. She had to stay strong, not just for herself, but for Amaya. "I won't let that happen, I promise." Her phone buzzed again. Another message, another threat. Renee glanced at the screen and saw an anonymous text. "Drop the case or you'll regret it." Her resolve hardened. She couldn't back down now. The stakes were too high. Jack sat alone in his dingy apartment, the remnants of his once pristine life scattered around him. His suspension from the force weighed heavily on him, but that wasn't the worst of it. The guilt over what he'd done to Renee gnawed at him every waking hour, and the nightmares about his daughter's death haunted him each night. His phone rang, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was Officer Jenna Park, his partner and one of the few people who hadn't completely turned their back on him. "Jack, how are you holding up?" Jenna asked, her tone gentle but concerned. "Not great," Jack admitted, rubbing his temples. "I can't stop thinking about everything. What I did, What's going on with this case? It's like everything is spiraling out of control. Jenna hesitated. I've been digging into some things, Jack. I don't think what happened with Renee was a coincidence. What do you mean? Jack's voice sharpened, his heart starting to race. There's more to this case than just a mistake. Someone's pulling the strings behind the scenes, and I think you're just a pawn in their game. Jack's pulse quickened. Oh, who would set me up like that? Jenna sighed. I don't know yet, but if I were you, I'd start looking at the people you thought you could trust. Jack stared at the wall, his mind spinning. Could it be possible? Was someone manipulating the entire situation to destroy him and Renee? And if so, why? Renee sat at the small table in her apartment, the dim light from the kitchen casting long shadows across the room. Her phone buzzed again, another message from her past, another reminder that she couldn't escape it. This time, it wasn't a threat. It was a message from an old contact, someone she hadn't heard from in years. We need to talk. Renee's heart sank. She knew what this meant. Her past, the life she had worked so hard to bury, was clawing its way back into her world. She thought she had left it all behind when she became a mother, when she decided to be better for Amaya. But now it seemed like her past was going to ruin everything she had built. She took a deep breath and texted back. When and where? The response came quickly. Tonight. Usual place. The usual place. A grimy bar on the outskirts of town where she used to meet her handler, Marcus Shaw, back when she was working as a police informant. She had thought those days were over. She had thought she could outrun the shadows. Later that night, Renee found herself sitting across from Marcus in the dimly lit bar. He looked older than she remembered, the weight of years showing on his face, but his eyes were still sharp, still calculating. You're in deep, Renee, Marcus said, his voice low but firm. This case, it's not just about you and that cop. There are people involved who want to make sure certain things never come to light. What things? Renee demanded, leaning forward, her heart pounding. Why me? Why now? Marcus sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. There's more at stake here than you realize. That cop Connolly, he's not just a random officer who lost control. He's tied to people who have been watching you for years, waiting for the right moment to strike. Renee's stomach twisted. What are you talking about? Marcus's gaze hardened. You weren't randomly targeted that night, Renee. Someone knew exactly who you were, and they're using this case to bring you down. They're using Connolly to get to you. Renee's blood ran cold. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but the picture they were forming was terrifying. Who's behind this? Renee asked, her voice shaking. I don't know for sure, Marcus admitted. But I know this, they'll stop at nothing to make sure you go down. And if you're not careful, they'll drag Amaya down with you. Renee's heart clenched at the thought of her daughter being caught in the crossfire. What can I do? Marcus leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. You're going to have to fight smarter, Renee. You're going to have to dig deep and find out who's really behind all this. And you're going to need help. Renee's mind raced. She couldn't do this alone. But who could she trust? The only person who might have answers was the one man she never wanted to see again. Detective Jack Connolly. The next day, Renee stood outside Jack's apartment, her hands trembling as she knocked on the door. She hated that it had come to this, that she was standing in front of the man who had assaulted her, the man whose actions had thrown her life into chaos. But if Marcus was right, if there were bigger forces at play, she had no choice. Jack opened the door, his eyes widening in surprise when he saw her standing there. Renee? She swallowed hard, forcing herself to meet his gaze. We need to talk. Jack stepped aside, letting her in. The apartment was sparse and cold, much like the man standing before her. They stood in awkward silence for a moment before Renee finally spoke. I know you don't expect this, and trust me, I don't want to be here, Renee began, her voice tight with emotion. But there's something going on, something bigger than both of us. I think we were set up. Jack's brow furrowed. Set up? By who? Renee shook her head. I don't know yet, but there's someone pulling the strings, and they're using you to get to me. Jack's face darkened. Why? Why would they want to get to you? Renee hesitated. She didn't want to reveal her past, but she knew she had no choice. Because of who I used to be. I worked as an informant for the police years ago, and I think the people I was involved with are coming after me. Jack stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in. You were an informant? Renee nodded, her stomach churning. Yes, and now I think someone is trying to use that to destroy me, and you. Jack rubbed his temples, his mind spinning. What do you want me to do? Renee took a deep breath. I need your help. We have to figure out who's behind this. We have to stop them before they destroy both of us. Jack looked at her, a mix of anger, guilt, and something else, something like understanding, flickering in his eyes. He had never expected to find himself in this situation, but now he had no choice. All right, Jack said, his voice firm. Let's find out who's really pulling the strings. Renee nodded, feeling a strange mix of relief and fear. She had just made a deal with the man who had turned her life upside down. But if they were going to survive this, they had to work together. Renee sat at her kitchen table, papers spread out before her. Jack sat across from her, a heavy silence hanging between them. It was an unlikely alliance, but both knew they had no choice. The conspiracy had only just begun to reveal itself, and they needed answers before it consumed them both. We have to start somewhere, Jack muttered, flipping through a folder. Marcus is hiding something big. He's been involved in this from the start. Renee nodded, her eyes scanning the papers in front of her. He was my handler. He knew everything about my past life. If anyone was going to use it against me, it would be him. Jack rubbed his temples, frustration building. But why? Why now? What's the endgame here? Renee leaned back, her mind racing. I think it's about control. They need to keep me quiet, and they're using you to do it. If this case goes to trial, everything gets exposed. The corruption, the manipulation, all of it. Jack clenched his fists. We need more than speculation. We need proof. Renee's phone buzzed, interrupting the tense moment. She glanced at the screen and frowned. Another message from an unknown number. You're getting too close. Back off. Her heart raced, but she forced herself to stay calm. She couldn't afford to be rattled now. They're watching us, she said, showing Jack the message. Whoever's behind this knows we're digging. Jack's eyes darkened. Then we're on the right track. Later that day, Renee and Jack made their way to Marcus's office at the precinct. The tension between them was thick, but they both knew this confrontation was inevitable. They needed answers, and Marcus was the key. Marcus sat behind his desk, his face hard and unreadable as they entered. You're making a mistake coming here, he said, his voice low and dangerous. Renee stepped forward, her anger simmering just beneath the surface. You've been playing both sides, Marcus. You knew exactly what was going on with me and Jack, and you let it happen. Marcus didn't flinch. I told you to stay out of this, Renee. You should have listened. Jack crossed his arms, glaring at Marcus. You set us up. You've been pulling the strings from the start. Why? Marcus's eyes flicked between them, his expression cold. I didn't have a choice. This goes deeper than either of you understand. There are people above me, people who control everything. If I didn't follow orders, they would have taken me out too. Renee's heart pounded in her chest. So you sold us out to save yourself? Marcus stood, his voice rising. It's not that simple. You don't know what's at stake here. If you keep pushing, they'll come for you, Renee, and they won't stop with you. They'll go after Amaya. Renee's blood ran cold at the mention of her daughter. You're threatening my child now? Marcus shook his head. I'm warning you. Walk away from this before it's too late. Jack stepped forward, his fists clenched. You're a coward, Marcus. You could have fought back, but you chose to protect yourself instead of doing the right thing. Marcus's gaze hardened. You think you're any better? You've been a pawn in their game just like I was. The difference is, I survived. Renee's voice trembled with fury. Not for long. Back at her apartment, Renee paced the floor, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. Jack watched her, his own guilt and frustration mirrored in her every movement. They're going to come after Amaya, Renee muttered, her voice shaking. I can't let that happen. I can't lose her. Jack stood, his face grim. We won't let that happen. But we can't back down now, not when we're this close. Renee stopped, her eyes filled with tears. But what if Marcus is right? What if exposing this just puts my daughter in more danger? Jack walked over, placing a hand on her shoulder. You're fighting for her future, Renee. If we don't stop them, they'll keep coming after you, after her. You'll never be free. Renee swallowed hard, the weight of her decision pressing down on her. She had worked so hard to leave her past behind, to protect Amaya from the darkness she once lived in. But now, that darkness was threatening to engulf them both. "I don't know if I'm strong enough," she whispered. Jack's voice was steady. "You are, and you're not alone in this." Renee looked up at him, seeing the determination in his eyes. For the first time since the incident, she felt a flicker of hope. They were in this together, and maybe, just maybe, they could win. The next morning, Renee and Jack returned to the precinct, armed with new determination. They had a plan, and they were going to expose Marcus and the network of corruption he was tied to. Jack had spent the night gathering information, using old contacts and his own knowledge of the system to piece together the connections. And now, he was ready to make things right. As they walked through the precinct, Jack felt the weight of his past mistakes pressing down on him. He had been reckless, blinded by his own trauma, and he had hurt Renee in the process. But now, he was determined to make amends. "We're going to take them down," Jack said, his voice low as they approached Marcus's office. Renee nodded, her resolve firm. "For Amaya." They burst into Marcus's office, catching him off guard. "You two again?" Marcus growled, standing up from his desk. "You're done, Marcus," Jack said, stepping forward. "We know everything. You're not going to keep hiding behind your lies." Marcus's face twisted in anger. "You think you can take me down? You don't know who you're dealing with." Renee stepped forward, her voice steady. "We know enough, and we're not stopping until you and everyone you're working for are exposed." Jack pulled out a file, slamming it onto Marcus's desk. "This is everything we need to bring you down, all the connections, all the deals, all the people you've betrayed." Marcus glanced at the file, his face paling slightly, but he didn't back down. "You're making a mistake." "No," Jack said, his voice cold. "I'm fixing mine." With Marcus cornered, Renee and Jack knew they were close to uncovering the full extent of the conspiracy. They needed more than just Marcus's confession. They needed to connect him to the larger network of corruption that had been pulling the strings from the shadows. Renee stared at the file in front of her, her mind racing. There has to be something we're missing. Someone higher up, someone controlling Marcus. Jack nodded, flipping through the documents. "There's a name that keeps coming up in these files. Nathaniel Trask. He's a powerful businessman with ties to the police department and several shady dealings. He's the one funding everything." Renee's heart pounded. "So, he's the puppet master." Jack's jaw tightened, and Marcus was just his pawn. They looked at each other, the gravity of the situation settling in. They had uncovered the truth, but exposing it would be dangerous. Trask had resources, power, and influence, and he wouldn't go down easily. "We need to move fast," Jack said, his voice urgent. "If Trask finds out we know, he'll come after us, and he won't hesitate to go after Amaya." Renee's breath caught in her throat, fear tightening its grip on her. But she forced herself to stay focused. "Then we take him down before he can do anything." Jack nodded. "For Amaya." Together, they left the precinct, knowing that the final confrontation was looming. The deeper truth had been uncovered, but now they had to face the consequences of what they had found. And as they prepared for the battle ahead, both Renee and Jack knew that their lives and the lives of those they loved were on the line. Renee stood outside the grand, imposing building where her life was about to reach a breaking point. The sun had just started to set, casting long shadows across the street as she and Jack walked toward the entrance. The weight of what was about to happen pressed down on them, but there was no turning back. Inside, Marcus sat at his desk, waiting. He knew they were coming. He had known all along. His connection to Nathaniel Trask, the real mastermind behind the conspiracy, was too deep to sever now. Trask had made sure of that, and Marcus had no choice but to follow orders. Renee and Jack entered the building, their footsteps echoing in the empty hallways. When they reached Marcus's office, they found him standing, his hands in his pockets, looking out the window. "You're making a mistake," Marcus said, not bothering to turn around. "No, Marcus," Renee replied, her voice steady but cold. "You made the mistake when you sold me out." Marcus finally turned to face them, his expression hard. "You think you can just walk in here and take me down? You have no idea who you're dealing with." Jack stepped forward, his voice low and dangerous. "We know exactly who we're dealing with. Trask isn't as untouchable as you think. We have the evidence. Marcus's eyes flickered with something. Fear, maybe, but it was quickly masked by anger. You're playing a dangerous game, Connolly, and it's going to get you both killed. Renee's heart pounded in her chest, but she held her ground. We're not afraid of you, Marcus. This ends now. Marcus moved closer, his eyes narrowing. You're a fool, Renee. You think exposing Trask will fix everything? It won't. The system is too broken. Taking me down won't change that. Renee's voice shook with emotion. Maybe it won't fix the system, but it will stop people like you from ruining more lives. Jack reached into his jacket and pulled out a folder. Here's everything we need to bring you down. Your connections to Trask, the bribes, the deals, the cover-ups. It's all in here. Marcus's face paled, and for the first time his confident facade cracked. You're making a mistake, he repeated, but his voice was weaker now, less certain. Renee took a step forward, her voice firm. No, Marcus, the mistake was yours. The courtroom was packed. Reporters, activists, and curious onlookers filled every seat as Renee and Jack took their places at the front. Marcus sat at the defense table, his once cocky demeanor now replaced by a quiet resignation. He knew the evidence against him was overwhelming, and there was no escape. The trial moved quickly, with each piece of evidence presented like a dagger, cutting through the web of lies and deceit that Marcus and Trask had built. Jack testified, his words clear and measured as he recounted the events that had led them to this point. Renee sat beside him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as she listened to the truth finally come out. When the time came for Marcus to speak, he remained silent. There was nothing he could say to defend himself. The truth was out, and the public was hungry for justice. As the judge prepared to deliver his verdict, the room fell silent. The tension was palpable, every eye fixed on the bench. In the matter of Marcus Shaw and his involvement in a corrupt conspiracy, the judge began, the court finds the defendant guilty on all counts. A murmur of relief rippled through the crowd, but for Renee, it wasn't over. Trask was still out there, his influence far-reaching, and she knew that even though Marcus had fallen, the fight was far from finished. After the trial, Renee and Jack stood outside the courthouse, the weight of everything they had been through hanging heavy in the air. The media had descended, cameras flashing and reporters shouting questions, but they ignored it all, too exhausted to care. Jack lit a cigarette, taking a long drag before speaking. We got him, he said quietly, his voice hollow, but it doesn't feel like a victory. Renee nodded, her eyes distant. That's because it's not. Marcus was just a piece of the puzzle. Trask is still out there, still pulling strings. The system is still broken. Jack exhaled a cloud of smoke, his face grim. You're right. We took down one man, but the corruption goes deeper than we realized. It always does. Renee glanced at him, her expression pained. What do we do now? Keep fighting? How do we even begin to change something so broken? Jack looked at her, his eyes filled with regret and determination. We keep fighting because we have to. For Amaya, for the people who don't have a voice, for the ones who can't fight for themselves. Renee swallowed hard, the weight of his words settling in. It feels like an impossible fight. Jack nodded. Maybe it is, but we have to try. Weeks passed, and life slowly began to return to a semblance of normalcy for Renee. The trial had ended, Marcus had been convicted, and the media frenzy had died down, but the scars remained, both physical and emotional. Renee sat in her small, cozy apartment, watching as Amaya played with her dolls in the living room. The innocence in her daughter's face was both a comfort and a reminder of everything she had fought to protect. Jack had kept his distance since the trial, giving her the space she needed to heal. But Renee knew their journey wasn't over. They had forged a bond, one built on shared pain and the pursuit of justice, and that connection would always be there. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. When she opened it, Jack stood on the other side, his expression softer than she had ever seen. I wasn't sure if I should come by, he said, his voice hesitant. But I wanted to check on you, see how you're holding up. Renee smiled, stepping aside to let him in. I'm okay, she replied, her voice quiet but sincere. We're okay. Jack glanced around the apartment, his gaze lingering on Amaya for a moment before turning back to Renee. I'm glad to hear that. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of everything they had been through still hanging between them. Finally, Jack spoke again. I don't know what's next for me, he admitted, but I wanted you to know that I'm going to keep fighting. For you, for Amaya, for everyone who's been hurt by this system. Renee looked at him, her heart swelling with a mix of gratitude and sadness. I know you will, Jack. And I'll be fighting too. For Amaya, for a future where she doesn't have to live in fear. Jack nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. You're a good mother, Renee. Don't ever forget that. Renee blinked back tears, her voice barely a whisper. Thank you. Later that evening, after Jack had left, Renee sat with Amaya on the couch, their small apartment filled with the quiet hum of the world outside. Amaya snuggled against her mother, her innocent eyes gazing up at her. Mom? Amaya asked softly. Yes, baby? Are things going to be okay now? Renee looked down at her daughter, her heart aching with the weight of the question. She wished she could promise Amaya that everything would be perfect, that the world would be fair and just. But she knew better. The scars of the past wouldn't disappear overnight, and the fight for justice was far from over. But in that moment, sitting with Amaya in the warmth of their home, Renee knew one thing for certain. We're going to be okay, she said, her voice steady and filled with love. No matter what happens, we're going to be okay. Amaya smiled, resting her head against Renee's shoulder. I love you, Mom. I love you too, sweetheart. Renee whispered, pressing a kiss to her daughter's forehead. The future was uncertain, the fight for justice ongoing, but in that quiet moment, with Amaya safe in her arms, Renee felt a flicker of hope. And that was enough. The final brings Renee and Jack's journey to a bittersweet close. Justice is served, but the fight for change continues. The story ends on a hopeful note, with Renee and Amaya finding peace in their new beginning, even as the scars of the past linger.